May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and it's important to know how to combat the trauma you might have.
Today we have Richmond Therapist Nidhi Tewari with us to explain a couple techniques to cope with trauma. Nidhi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So right away, can you list the techniques that you're going to be diving into today?
Sure, yes. The first one is self-awareness. The second one is being able to recognize your triggers. The third one is name it to tame it or call it out to calm it down. The fourth is learning how to ride the wave of emotion. And the fifth is, of course, connecting with a trusted therapist.
Okay, so let's talk about these each individually. Self-awareness sounds pretty self-explanatory, but tell us about that one.
Yeah, it's actually, I think that is actually one of the biggest struggles that people encounter. We may have traumatic experiences in our past and have no acknowledgement that that is the case. So there's a really helpful questionnaire out there called the ACEs questionnaire that stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. And what it does is it goes through experiences from early childhood that we may not typically think of as traumatic. For example, growing up in a household where a parent struggled with alcoholism could be considered a traumatic experience. So being able to recognize and acknowledge that there's something you're struggling with is the first step, of course.
So, I mean, we're talking about childhood, but really trauma can happen at any age, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Trauma is anything that is too much, too fast, or too soon for our nervous system to handle. And we typically think of trauma as war and natural disasters, but it can include bullying, it can include divorce, it can include complicated grief. There's a whole variety of different experiences that may be felt as traumatic.
And then, of course, those then cause triggers that we have to recognize.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. So if you've ever had a conversation with your boss, for example, and there was a tone of voice or a way that criticism was delivered that stung a little bit more deeply, and you may have felt a type of way about it, well, it may be tied back to a time in your past, whether that was in adulthood or in your teenage years, where somebody gave you feedback in a similar way and it kind of cut deep. So we have these triggers that subconsciously come up. And if we're able to recognize that that's what is causing the reactions in our day-to-day lives, it can be very, very helpful for developing that awareness and that insight.
That's really interesting because there are a couple times when you have a conversation where you're like, ooh, that made me feel a certain way.
But it shouldn't have.
Yeah. So maybe that, yeah, you're kind of putting language to that.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. That often we just accept our day-to-day experiences as just what they are, but they're often tied back to familiar feelings from either earlier in our lives, childhood, wherever it is. But if we're reacting strongly, one of my mentors said, if it's hysterical, it's historical.
That's really good.
And I love this, especially having a toddler at home. You have to call it out to calm it down or name it to tame it. And talk about that, because that's really important, especially with kids.
Yes, 100%. So this is a concept that had been created by Dr. Dan Siegel. And the idea is that when we're able to name an emotion, our nervous system immediately starts calming down. Often our first go-to is to try to distract away from a feeling or to perhaps not lean into it, but it actually gets stronger and more intense the more we lean away. So if we can acknowledge, hey, I'm feeling anxious in this moment, or I'm scared of the outcome of this new scary thing that I'm doing, that actually helps so much in managing the emotions. And with kids, we have to provide them the language with which to better understand their internal world and their internal experiences.
This has been so enlightening. Thank you so much for just putting all of this language to feelings today, Nidhi. We really appreciate it. And to learn more about these techniques in Mental Health Awareness Month, you can head over to Nidhi Tewari, lcsw.com.